The autumn did not arrive that year as a season. It arrived as a creditor. Early, uninvited, stripping the trees of Hollowell Park before summer had the grace to properly depart. Eleanor Voss stood at the long window of the drawing-room and watched the grounds go thin and brown, and she did not think of the cold, or the shortening days, or the coal they could not quite afford to order in sufficient quantity. She thought, as she often did in quiet moments, of how invisible a person could become inside the very house they had held together with their own 2 hands. She was 26. She was the elder of the 2 Voss daughters by 5 years, and it showed, not in lines or grey hairs, for she had neither yet, but in something steadier and more weathered than youth generally permitted. She wore a dress of dove-grey, as she almost always did, because dove-grey was the colour that drew no remark. She had learned over many years of being unremarked upon that this was the safest economy available to her. Grey did not attract, and grey did not offend. It simply existed, which was, she had decided, a form of freedom when the alternative was to exist loudly in a house that had no room for loudness. The house was draughty. It had always been draughty. She had grown accustomed to laying extra blankets at the foot of her mother's bed on cold nights and doing without her own, to instructing the kitchen maid on how to make the week's provisions stretch to cover an unexpected guest, to sitting nearest the window at her writing desk because the candles were an expense best deferred. She had grown accustomed to being thanked for none of this. Some tasks, she had discovered, are performed most effectively by people whom no one thinks to notice performing them. She was the person no one thought to notice. She had made her peace with this in the way that people make peace with a recurring cold, not with acceptance exactly, but with a practical familiarity that functions as its substitute. She knew the names of all 3 of the remaining household staff. She knew which floorboard in the upper corridor gave way underfoot and had placed a rug over it without remarking on it. She knew that the parlour fire drew better when the east window was cracked by a finger's width, and she cracked it every evening before her mother came downstairs, so that the room would be warm and her mother would not wonder why. These were the things she knew. These were the things she did. And no one knew that she did them, which was, she had long since decided, simply the condition of her life. Her sister Cecilia came through the door in a rush of ivory muslin, and the particular kind of energy that had always seemed to Eleanor like the room itself leaning forward. Cecilia was, by every measure that the county applied, the beauty of the family. She was 21 and golden-haired, and she laughed with the absolute confidence of someone who had never once needed to wonder whether she was welcome. The county adored her. Their mother adored her. Their few remaining creditors, in their way, probably adored her too, because she made the whole enterprise of Hollowell Park feel less like a failing estate, and more like a stage. "He is coming," Cecilia announced, not to Eleanor particularly, but to the room, to the air, to the imagined audience she always seemed to address. "Prince Sebastian of Waldenmere is coming to Ashworth Hall, and Lady Ashworth has written to say there will be a reception, and we are among those invited." Their mother appeared in the doorway almost immediately, as she always did when Cecilia raised her voice in excitement, drawn by some maternal instinct that had never, Eleanor noted, extended to the quieter sounds of corks being pushed into bottles of economy wine or account books being closed with an audible exhale. "A prince," their mother said, pressing both hands to her sternum as though her heart required physical assistance. "Oh, Cecilia! Oh, my darling! A prince!" Eleanor turned back to the window. A single beech leaf pressed briefly against the glass, and then fell. She watched it go. She had heard of Prince Sebastian, of course. The province was small enough that reputations travelled faster than carriages. He was the second son of the ruling house of Waldenmere, elevated 2 years prior to Crown Prince when his elder brother died. unexpectedly, under circumstances that people discussed in lowered voices, as though the grief itself might overhear and take offence. He was said to be severe. He was said to be brilliant and remote in equal measure, the kind of man whose silences were not comfortable ones. He was wealthy in the way that old houses are wealthy, with a weight behind it that new money could never quite replicate, and he was, by every account Eleanor had gathered without particularly seeking them, not given to warmth. He had also, it was widely known, refused 3 very advantageous matches in the preceding 2 years, each with a woman of impeccable lineage and noted beauty, and the province was alive with speculation about when he would capitulate to the matter of a wife, and who, precisely, would be fortunate enough to absorb his brooding severity into her life. Eleanor did not wonder precisely what it might be like to be the object of such a choice. She was not, she had long since concluded, the kind of woman about whom such choices were made. She was competent and kind, and possessed of a practical intelligence that served everyone around her very well, and she was unremarkable in the ways that mattered to drawing-rooms. She accepted this without particular bitterness. Bitterness required a kind of sustained outward attention she could not always afford. What she did think, watching the beech leaves give themselves over to the wind, was that the invitation was Cecilia's, in all but the technical wording, and that the prince, if he was at all like the men the county produced in quantity, would look once at Cecilia's golden hair and her easy laugh, and the way a room tilted toward her, like flowers toward a particular window, and that would be that. She thought this plainly, without self-pity, the way one thinks about weather. Not because one welcomes it, but because it is coming regardless, and standing in its path has never changed the direction of rain. The reception at Ashworth Hall was held on the 1st of October, which the weather treated as an opportunity rather than an occasion. The hall itself was a study in the kind of deliberate grandeur that is meant to communicate something to its visitors, and largely succeeds. Fireplaces roared in 3 of the 4 main rooms. The candelabras were not on any economy at all. Lady Ashworth had laid out supper for 40, and the 40 arranged themselves across the rooms in the way that people at such gatherings always do, clustering according to allegiance and precedence with the invisible efficiency of a system that has been running without revision for several generations. Cecilia wore a dress the color of new cream, and positioned herself, with the unerring instinct of someone who has never had to think carefully about positioning, at the precise center of the room most likely to be entered by the guest of honor. Eleanor wore grey. She stood near the bookcase at the far end of the lesser parlor and watched the guests move and murmur, and she thought about whether the account she had sent to the grain merchant had been received, and whether she had remembered to write to their aunt in Severn regarding the matter of the silver candlesticks, and she did not particularly watch the door. She was good at making herself useful in any room, and she was good at being unobtrusive in it, and both of these things had in common the quality of requiring her full attention for their execution. This was, she had found over the years, a reasonable way to pass an evening. She had passed many evenings this way, and she expected to pass many more, and she did not dwell on the particular weight of having never once stood at the center of any room while it tilted toward her. She became aware that she was being watched before she had any rational evidence of it. It was a peculiar sensation, not unpleasant, but precise, like the feeling of a candle being held close without the heat quite reaching. She turned her head by small degrees, as she had trained herself to do in situations where drawing attention was the one thing she wished to avoid, and found, at an angle across the room, a man watching her with an expression of absolute stillness. He was taller than most of the room, and darker in coloring, with eyes that she could not quite determine the shade of at this distance, but which struck her, in an absurd and immediate way, as the color of deep water in winter. He was not smiling. He did not appear to be the kind of man who smiled as a default condition. He was watching her with the concentrated attention of someone who had found something they did not entirely expect to find, and who had not yet decided what to do with the discovery. She looked away. It seemed the sensible thing. She returned her attention to the bookcase, pulled a slim volume from the shelf, and opened it to a page she did not read. She heard Cecilia's laugh from the other room, the particular bell-bright peal of it that had always carried, and the answering murmur of several male voices, and she turned a page she had not read, and stood in her grey dress among the books, and was, as was her custom, invisible. She did not know, then, that he had crossed the room towards Cecilia twice in the preceding hour, and found himself rerouted, each time by some interior navigation she could not have named. She did not know that he had stood in the archway between the two rooms for the better part of 7 minutes and watched her read a book she was not reading, and that what he had seen in those 7 minutes was something the rest of the room had spent years training themselves not to see. She did not know any of this until later, and by then it had ceased to surprise her. What she knew, that evening, was only that when she finally glanced back to the place across the room where he had been standing, he was gone, and the space where he had been felt, unreasonably, emptied. She told herself this was the effect of candlelight on an already long evening, replaced the unread book on its shelf, and went in search of a glass of water. The proposal came 11 days later. It came not, as her mother and Cecilia had been quietly, industriously expecting, to Cecilia. It came in a letter addressed to the head of the Voss household, their mother, in the technical absence of their late father, worded in the formal and precise language of a man unaccustomed to being refused, making clear that the Prince of Waldenmere wished to discuss terms for a match with Miss Eleanor Margaret Voss, eldest daughter of the late Thomas Voss, and requesting the earliest convenient opportunity to do so. The silence that followed the reading of this letter was the loudest silence Eleanor had ever occupied. She watched her mother read it twice. She watched Cecilia read it over their mother's shoulder, and then step back, and then read it again, as though the words might have rearranged themselves into something more sensible. She felt the air in the room change texture entirely, as though the molecule of it closest to Cecilia had contracted slightly, and those nearest Eleanor had expanded, quietly and without ceremony, into the space that opened. "There must be an error," Cecilia said. Her voice was perfectly even. She was 21 and beautiful, and she had never, not once in her life, been passed over for a thing she had decided to want. Their mother said nothing. She set the letter on the small writing table and pressed her hands together and looked at Eleanor with an expression that Eleanor had never precisely seen on her face before. Not quite pride, not quite apology, not quite recognition. Something she did not have a word for. Eleanor stood in her grey dress and felt, somewhere in the architecture of her chest, a door she had not known was locked. Release very quietly one pin of its tumbler. She did not say, "I am surprised." She did not say, "I cannot imagine why." She said carefully, "I should like to speak with him myself before any answer is given." No one objected. In the moment, Eleanor thought it was because no one had yet recovered sufficiently to think of objecting. Later, she understood it differently. Later, she understood that they had looked at her, really looked perhaps for the first time, and found, without warning, someone looking back. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Prince Sebastian came on a Tuesday in a carriage that made the Hollowell Park gravel sound expensive. Eleanor received him in the small sitting room that got the best of the morning light, which was her room in the practical sense, the one she used when she wished to think, the one with the good chair and the writing desk, and the view of the walled garden she had been coaxing back to adequacy for the better part of 3 years. She chose it deliberately. She did not know precisely what she was communicating by choosing it, but she chose it. She had arranged no flowers. She had asked for tea to be brought, and had not fussed over the arrangement of the cups. She sat in her good chair and waited for him to arrive, and she was neither nervous nor composed, she was simply present, which was, she had found, the most honest posture available to a person. He was taller in a closed room. He wore his severity like a well-fitted coat, present but not ostentatious, clearly permanent. He looked at the room when he entered it, and then at her, and then he sat where she indicated and folded his hands on his knee and waited, which surprised her. She had expected him to speak first, to make the opening move in whatever negotiation this was intended to be. He did not. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who has sat in a very great many rooms and knows that hurry rarely improves anything. She sat opposite him and looked at him directly, which was, she had learned, the most honest thing one person could offer another. "I would like to understand," she said, "why you have asked for me." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the almost of one, the faint architectural suggestion of what a smile might be if it ever fully arrived. "Because," he said, "I watched you for the better part of an evening stand in a room that had arranged itself to exclude you, and hold yourself with the quiet dignity of someone who had decided that the room's opinion of her value was not, in fact, the authoritative measure of it. That is a rarer quality than beauty. It is, in my experience, considerably more durable." She did not speak for a moment. Outside, a sparrow landed briefly on the walled garden's gate and departed. "You watched me read a book I was not reading?" she said. "Yes," he said. "That too." She looked at her hands, and then at him again. "I will not be married for charity," she said, "and I will not be kept out of ornamental usefulness. If I come to Waldenmere, I come as a person with a view of things and the habit of speaking it." "I would find silence," he said, "a considerable disappointment." She was quiet for 3 seconds, and 4 and 5, and she thought about the grey dresses in her wardrobe, and the account books on her writing desk, and the walled garden that nobody had noticed her restoring for 3 years. And she thought about a door with one pin of its lock released. And she said, "Yes, then." It was not, by any standard measure, a romantic acceptance. It was honest, which was, she had always privately believed, a more sustainable foundation than romance, and which seemed to be precisely what he had come looking for. She told no one, that night, what it had felt like to say the word. She sat at her writing desk in the small room that got the best morning light, and she looked at the walled garden in the dark, and she thought about what it meant to be offered a thing, not because you were beautiful or convenient or the obvious choice, but because someone had stood in a doorway and watched you hold yourself together in a room that was not watching back, and had decided that this was the truest thing they had seen all evening. She did not know if that would prove to be enough. She knew only that it was the first time anyone had chosen her for the self she actually was, and that this felt, in its quiet way, like the most remarkable thing that had ever happened to her. Waldenmere Palace was cold. She had been told it was large, and it was. It was the kind of large that makes a human figure look briefly theoretical. But the cold was what she had not anticipated in quite the way it arrived. Not merely the physical cold of stone corridors and high ceilings and fires that were laid correctly, but somehow joylessly, as though warmth were a performance being given for an absent audience. The cold was in the quality of the rooms themselves, in the dust covers draped over whole wings of furniture, in the way the servants moved through the spaces with the efficiency of people who have learned that making themselves agreeable risks making themselves noticed. The palace had a particular sound, too, or rather, a particular quality of soundlessness, the deep quiet of a place where no one laughed, where footsteps were careful, where doors were closed rather than shut. She arrived on a grey November afternoon when the grounds were stripped and the sky was the colour of old pewter. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Alderton, angular and meticulous, who had served the household for 22 years and whose face held the expression of someone reserving judgment as a professional practice, showed her through the principal rooms with the precision of a woman reading from an inventory. The state rooms were magnificent and airless. The family wing was handsome and dim. The kitchens were warm in the way that only kitchens manage, and the small sounds of industry that came from behind their door were the first sounds in the palace that struck Elinor as genuinely alive. Elinor did not exclaim at the grandeur, which she could see Mrs. Alderton had anticipated. She asked, instead, about the rooms that were shuttered, and whether the rose garden to the east had always been left unattended, and whether the staff took their meals together or separately, and whether there was a room with good morning light that she might use as a working sitting-room. Mrs. Alderton's face did not change, but there was, at the question about the rose garden, a fractional pause, the pause of a woman who has been asked a question no one has thought to ask before. The garden was Lady Marin's, Mrs. Alderton said after a moment. His Highness's mother. It has been some years now. I see, Elinor said. And she did see, and she filed it away with the other things she was beginning to understand about the architecture of the house and the man inside it. She did not immediately attempt the garden. She was not impetuous. She understood that trust is built in small and consistent increments, and she began instead with the easier territories. She learned the name of every member of the household staff within her first week. She learned that the underfootman, Brett, had an anxious manner that came from having been reprimanded twice by the previous house steward for dropping a tray, and she made a point of speaking to him as a matter of course, not because she required anything, but because she had noticed that being spoken to ordinarily was, for people unaccustomed to it, a form of restoration. She asked him whether the fireplace in the east corridor was drawing properly, because she had noticed it smelled faintly of damp soot. He told her, with the careful surprise of someone unaccustomed to being consulted, that it had not drawn well for 2 winters, and she arranged for the chimney sweep within the fortnight. She found the kitchen, which was below stairs and excellent, run by a Mrs. Payne who had strong opinions about braised meats and no expectation that anyone upstairs held a similar view, and she spent a Tuesday afternoon there learning which provisions were sourced locally and whether the household kept an autumn garden. She engaged Mrs. Payne's opinions as opinions rather than as reports, and Mrs. Payne, who had not been consulted on a domestic matter in 7 years of service, offered an entire hour of strongly held views on the inadequacy of the palace's vegetable plot and the superior merits of a particular local butcher, whom the previous household steward had inexplicably ceased to patronize. Elinor came upstairs at the end of that afternoon with a list of practical improvements and a cook who, for the first time in recent memory, had laughed at something. She began also in those first weeks to open certain rooms. Not all at once, she was not reckless, but one at a time, gently, as one opens a window in a room that has been closed too long and allows the air to return by degrees rather than all at once. She pulled the dust covers from a set of chairs in the east sitting room and had them carried to the window to air. She found a small music room that no one appeared to have used in several years and sat in it one afternoon with a book, not because she played, but because the room felt as though it had been waiting to be occupied, and she thought something ought to be done about that. Sebastian found her there once and said nothing, only looked at her with his steady winter eyes, and then walked on, and she considered this neither an approval nor a rebuke, simply the acknowledgment of a man learning that his house was being quietly returned to itself. The long dining table remained, for now. It was a remarkable object. It could have seated 32 at full extension, and did so without irony on the evenings when Sebastian held formal dinners, which were infrequent and conducted with the joyless precision of a state function. On the evenings when they dined privately, which were more common, they sat at opposite ends of it like 2 countries conducting a summit across a stretch of mahogany that had never quite decided which side of the room it preferred. She was the one who finally said, one quiet evening in December, when the snow had come and the fire was actually warm, "This table is absurd." He looked up from his correspondence, which he frequently read at dinner, because no one had ever indicated that this was unwelcome. "It is," he agreed, without a trace of defensiveness. "Could we move to something smaller?" she said. "Something that does not require me to raise my voice to ask you whether you take sugar." He did not answer immediately. He set down his letter and looked at the table, and then at her, with an expression that was— she was beginning to recognize these, not quite a smile, but the serious second cousin of one. "I take no sugar," he said. "I should have made that clear." "I know," she said. "I have been observing. I was making a rhetorical point." He was quiet for a moment, and then, quite without preparation, he laughed. It was brief, and it seemed to surprise him slightly, as if a door had blown open somewhere in the house that he had assumed was sealed. Eleanor did not remark on it. She simply noted it the way one notes the first thaw in the garden. Quietly, without celebration, understanding that celebration would be premature. The long table was shortened by 6 feet within the week. The first evening they sat at its reduced length. There were 3 feet between them instead of 15. She could see his face clearly, without arrangement. He could see hers. The candles, no longer required to illuminate a small runway, felt warmer. "Better," she said. "Considerably," he agreed. It was on an evening in early January, when the grounds were frozen and the palace's east fire was finally drawing properly, and the wind had settled into the long, steady note it held all winter over those particular hills, that he told her about his brother. She had not pressed for it. She had waited, and the waiting had been the correct thing, because it came as a kind of surfacing. A man who has held his breath for a very long time finally exhaling, not because the air is perfectly safe, but because he has simply run out of the capacity to hold it any longer. His brother Aldrich had been the heir, and clever, and well-loved, and entirely unsuited by temperament to the demands of the crown. He had known it, and Sebastian had known it, and their father had not wished to know it, and the machinery of the succession had ground forward regardless. Aldrich had been engaged to a woman he did not love, who loved him with a kind of ferocity that has no room for anything soft in it. He had died 2 days before the wedding, not by any external hand, and not by illness, but by the accumulation of a particular kind of silence that has no name in medicine and every name in grief. He had been 28 years old, and he had been Sebastian's only brother, and he had left behind a note that Sebastian had read once, and burned and not spoken of again to anyone alive. Sebastian had stood in the empty chapel and understood, without being able to say it to anyone, that the crown had cost him his brother, and that the crown was now his, and that these two facts lived together in him like 2 locked rooms that shared a wall. Eleanor sat with this for a long time. The fire shifted. The wind moved against the windows. She did not offer comfort in the conventional sense, because she understood that certain griefs are not improved by being handled, only by being witnessed. She let the silence have its proper weight, and she stayed in it with him. And that was the whole of what she did, and it was enough. She had sat with silence before. She had sat with it in the Hollowell Park drawing-room after her father's death, when her mother could not stop weeping, and Cecilia could not stop talking, and Eleanor had simply remained very still, the fixed point around which the family's grief arranged itself without ever quite acknowledging that it was doing so. Silence was not, to her, an absence. It was a room of its own. She knew how to be useful in it. "You have been governing a country," she said finally, "while carrying a house on your back." "An imprecise metaphor," he said, "but not an inaccurate one." "Sebastian," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without a title preceding it. and the word landed differently from every other word she had spoken in that room. He heard it. She saw him hear it. It was like a key turning in a lock, not a dramatic sound, but a conclusive one, the sound of something releasing that had been engaged for a very long time. "Eleanor," he said very quietly. They sat on opposite sides of the fire for a moment longer, and then the world, as it always does, closed over it like water. But something had moved in the way that glaciers move, not visibly, not in any single moment, but irrevocably, in a direction that would not be reversed. Spring came to Waldenmere in fits and starts, the way it does in places that have forgotten how to receive warmth. Eleanor went to the East Garden in the second week of March, with her practical boots and her grey working dress. And she began. The Rose Garden was not a ruin exactly. It was a garden that had been allowed to understand that no one was coming. The canes were overgrown in the determined way of living things that have stopped waiting for direction and begun directing themselves, and the beds were thick with the particular kind of weed that appears only in soils that have been rich and are not tended. She worked for 3 hours on that first day, until her hands ached, and the cold came back into the air with the authority of a reminder, and she stopped and looked at what she had uncovered. Good soil, still beneath everything, and went inside satisfied. She did not need it to be beautiful yet. She needed it only to be attended to. There is, she had always believed, a particular kind of dignity in being attended to. She had learned this mostly from the experience of its absence. She did not mention it to Sebastian. She did not need to. He would see it, or he would not, and either would be fine. He saw it. He came to the library window one afternoon in late March, and stood looking out at the East Garden where she was working, and she did not look up for some time, and when she finally did, he was simply watching, with an expression she had not seen on his face in the months she had been accumulating his expressions, something unguarded, something that had not been constructed for any audience. He never joined her in the garden, but the roses that summer came in extraordinary abundance. It was Mrs. Alderton who told her, in the measured way of a woman who releases information only after careful assessment of its impact, that the rose garden had not been touched since the Lady Maren died 8 years prior, that Sebastian had walked past it every day for 8 years without entering, that the staff had understood, without being told, that it was not a subject to be raised. Mrs. Alderton said all of this while straightening a candle on the mantel, with her eyes on her work rather than on Eleanor's face, which Eleanor recognized as a form of courtesy from a woman not generally given to it. "He watches from the window," Mrs. Alderton said, "as he did as a boy, when his mother worked in it." Eleanor said nothing. She pressed the information into the quiet part of herself, where the useful things were stored, and she went back the next morning, and she worked. By June, the east beds were cleared. By July, the first canes had been cut back to the proper height and tied with a patience that Mrs. Alderton, who had made it her business to observe from the upper corridor window, described to Mrs. Payne as remarkable. By August, there were blooms, small at first, then fuller, then, in the warmth of the late summer, extraordinary. They were the deep red of the old roses, the kind that have been cultivated long enough to carry in their scent the memory of every summer before this one. Sebastian did not go into the garden, but he left the library window open on warm evenings, and the roses came in. The scandal came in May, carried, as scandals tend to be in court society, through a series of private conversations that were never quite private enough. A letter, it was said. A letter from Eleanor's time in Hollowell, written to a man. To a former attachment, people said, with the rich intonation of those for whom attachment is a story category rather than an experience. A letter of an intimate nature. Such letters, once in circulation, have a way of expanding in the retelling, until the original object is barely recognizable beneath its accumulated interpretations. Eleanor heard about it first from a court lady, whose function appeared to be the distribution of intelligence that benefited certain parties and damaged others. She received the information without expression. She had learned, a long time ago, that expression was exactly what they wanted. The letter, in fact, existed. She had written it. It had been written to Daniel Marsh, with whom she had spent 8 months of her 23rd year in a careful, considered, ultimately fruitless attempt to construct a future. He had, upon the conclusion of this attempt, told her that she would regret leaving him, in the voice of a man who believes that his own bitterness is a kind of prophecy. She had been, at the time, too tired for the argument, and had left, and had regretted nothing. The letter itself was perfectly ordinary. An honest letter, the kind she wrote, the kind that contained actual things. There was nothing in it that she was ashamed of. This did not, she understood, mean very much in the economy of scandal, where what a thing actually contains matters less than the suggestion of what it might. She was familiar with the mechanics of this economy. She had simply never previously been its subject. She also understood, in the clear way that she understood most things, who was behind it. Cecilia had come to Waldenmere 3 weeks prior for a formal visit, brought by their mother, installed in the East Guest Wing, resplendent in her cream muslins and her golden hair and the particular energy of a person who has decided that a situation calls for reassessment. She had been charming at dinner. She had been charming in the drawing-room. She had laughed at Sebastian's dry remarks with the practiced ease of someone who understood that laughter was a form of currency, and she had watched Eleanor with the careful attention of a woman revising a calculation. Eleanor had watched her watch and had understood, without particular drama, what was being calculated. Daniel Marsh had been in debt, as men of his kind reliably were, and debts had a way of resolving themselves when persons with the ability to resolve them were sufficiently motivated. It was, once she had all the pieces, a simple enough architecture. She was not angry about it, precisely. She was tired in the particular way one is tired when someone has confirmed a thing one had hoped not to know. The court murmured. Certain rooms that had been warming toward her cooled again. She saw it in the angle of heads, the particular rearrangement of guests' positions when she entered a drawing-room. She wore her grey dress. She held herself with the quiet dignity of someone who has decided that other people's opinions of her value are not, in fact, the authoritative measure of it. She was afraid, in the private interior place she kept for things she could not use, and she did not show it, because she had learned young that fear shown is fear confirmed. Sebastian said nothing to her directly in the 2 days following. She did not know whether he had heard, or believed, or was conducting some interior assessment she could not see. She told herself she was not afraid of the assessment. She was, in fact, afraid of it, which she did not tell herself, because there was nothing useful to do with the information. On the 3rd day, he found her in the library. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she waited, and he looked at her with an expression she had learned to read, by then, as the precursor to something true. "I know about the letter," he said. "I assumed you did." She said, "I also know," he said, "who produced it, and how, and at what cost. A man named Marsh settled a debt with a London creditor on the 14th of this month. The creditor was, 1 step removed, in the employ of a member of your family. The relevant debt papers are now in my possession." She was quiet for a moment. Something behind her sternum loosened by a degree. "You investigated," she said. "I looked," he said, "at what was in front of me. It is something I have been practicing. There was a royal reception at Ashworth Hall on the last evening of May, hosted by Lady Ashworth, who navigated the aristocracy of the province like a woman who knows every current and chooses her route accordingly. The rooms were full, chandeliers lit to their absolute capacity, silks in every colour except the particular dove grey that stood near the bookcase in the far parlour, composed, watching. Cecilia was at the center of the principal room, as she always was, radiant and golden and burning with the particular brightness of someone who has placed a significant wager and is waiting for the outcome. She had positioned herself beautifully. The room had arranged itself around her, as rooms always had. She laughed. Several people laughed with her. The mechanics of her appeal operated, as they always had, with frictionless efficiency. Eleanor stood near the window. She was not hiding. She had stopped hiding quite some time ago. She was simply standing in her grey dress, watching the room with the same steady eyes that had watched the Hollowell Park grounds go thin and brown 3 seasons prior, that had read the account books and tended the walled garden and listened to a man tell her, in a small, cold sitting room, about the kind of grief that has no name in medicine. She was thinking about rose canes and fires that drew correctly, and a man who had stood at a window for 8 years watching a garden grow wild, and she was thinking that this evening would be whatever it was going to be, and that she had, in the end, chosen honesty over strategy, which was the only choice she knew how to make and live with afterward. She became aware of silence before she could place its source. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a tide goes out, by degrees retreating from the far edges first, until the center was the last place speaking, and then that too fell quiet. Sebastian had entered the room. This was not of itself remarkable. He was expected. What was remarkable was the direction he walked. He did not pause at the center of the room. He did not stop at the radius of the golden-haired woman who had arranged herself to receive him. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows precisely where he is going, and the crowd, reading this as crowds do, parted around him. He crossed the room and stopped in front of Eleanor. She looked up at him. It was still a looking up. He was still that tall. And she thought, absurdly, of a sparrow landing on a garden gate. He spoke loudly enough that the room could hear. He had not raised his voice. It simply carried the way things carry when a room has stopped producing any sound of its own. "There is a letter," he said, "that has been circulated about my wife. I would like to address it. The letter is genuine. It was written by a woman of 23 who was honest enough to write what she meant to a man she was attempting, in good faith, to love. It contains nothing that any person of sense and decency would find remarkable. It was obtained by that man in settlement of a debt arranged by a person in this room who believed that my wife's honesty could be used as a weapon against her." His eyes moved briefly to where Cecilia stood at the center of the silent room, and then returned to Eleanor. "She was wrong about that. Honesty is not a liability. It is, in my estimation, the quality most worth choosing, the one I have found over the course of a year and a great deal of previous error to be irreplaceable." He reached into his coat and produced a small document, the debt paper, she understood. He held it a moment, and then he set it on the mantel of the room's largest fireplace, with the deliberate simplicity of a man setting down something he has carried long enough. "The matter," he said, "is concluded." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, in the still, quiet room, with all its chandeliers blazing and all its silks unmoving, and she felt in the architecture of her chest the last pin of a very old lock release. She did not cry. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of her tears. But her eyes, her quiet, grey, observant eyes, went bright in a way that had nothing to do with the chandeliers, and Sebastian saw it, because he had been paying attention for a year now, and paying attention to Eleanor was a practice that had made him considerably better at everything. "Thank you," she said, which was not what she meant entirely, but was the beginning of what she meant. "I chose you," he said quietly now. "For her alone. Not for your family's name, which is unremarkable, not for your face, which is beautiful to me and only incidentally to others, not for the debts you have quietly paid, or the fires you have correctly drawn, or the garden you have restored, or the cook you have made laugh. I chose you because you stood in a room that had decided not to see you, and you looked at it as though its decision was its misfortune rather than yours." He paused. "And I was right. It was its misfortune." She looked at him for a long time in the candle-lit, silent room. And then, very quietly, the way the first warmth comes back to a garden that has been cold for a long time, she smiled. The world closed over the moment as it always did, the way water closes over a stone. The room resumed itself, cautiously, in the way of rooms that have witnessed something they know they will be discussing for some time. Cecilia stood in the centre of it, still the golden hair and the cream muslin unchanged, and if Eleanor had looked at her, she would have seen not malice in her face, but something smaller and sadder, the expression of a woman who has understood, too late and all at once, that what she wanted was not what she had spent her life arranging herself to receive. She had wanted to be chosen, and she had been all her life by everyone, but not by the one person whose choosing had turned out to matter, and the difference between those two things was not a small one. Eleanor did not look. She was not cruel. She was simply, at that particular moment, occupied. Daniel Marsh left the province 6 weeks later, which was a quiet conclusion to a small story, and the debt papers were never spoken of again. 1 year later, in the rose garden that had come in with extraordinary abundance for the second summer running, there was a child. She was called Maren, for the woman who had planted the garden first, and she had her father's winter-dark hair and her mother's observant eyes and the general demeanour of a person who has arrived into a warm house after a very long cold, and intends to stay. She reached for things without hesitation. She laughed without calculation. She had never been invisible a day of her life, and she would not be, because her mother had worked very carefully to ensure that the world she was born into was not the same world she herself had inherited. Warmer by several degrees, lighter by several rooms, populated by people who had learned, from a woman in a grey dress who asked their names and remembered them, that the act of being seen is not a gift to be rationed, but a practice to be kept. Eleanor sat in the garden in the late afternoon light, in a dress of a colour that was not grey. It was the blue of deep water before dark, a gift, chosen because Sebastian had one day simply appeared in her dressing-room doorway and said that he found the grey dresses indistinguishable from the walls, and that he had always been able to find her by other means, but preferred, when possible, to use his eyes. And she watched her daughter reach for a rose with the absolute confidence of someone who has never been told the world is not arranged to welcome her. Sebastian sat beside her close, as he had been in the habit of sitting since the long table had been shortened, and he was not reading correspondence. He was watching his daughter and his wife in the late light, with an expression that was unmistakably a smile. A full one, finally arrived, the almost of it long since resolved into the thing itself. Mrs. Alderton had noted to Mrs. Payne that His Highness had smiled 3 times in the preceding week. Mrs. Payne had said that she was not surprised, and had returned to her braised lamb, and the 2 women had said nothing further on the subject, which was its own kind of commentary. He had not, as it happened, been particularly lucky. He had not stumbled into something by chance or fortune or the vagaries of a crowded reception-room. He had simply, on an October evening in a house full of people who were very loudly being seen, paid attention to the one person who was very quietly being everything. He had not found her. He had looked. The distinction mattered. Finding implies accident, implies that the thing found was simply waiting in the path of whoever happened to walk it. Looking is different. Looking requires a decision, made and held and returned to, against the persistent and loud claims of a world insisting you look elsewhere. He had looked at Eleanor Voss in a room that had arranged itself to exclude her. He had looked again, and again, and when she had given him every reason to look away, in fear, in grief, in the long quiet of a cold palace that was slowly learning to be warm, he had not. That was all. That, in the end, was everything. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.